Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. My guest for this episode is Dr. Pierre Berastain, who is a leader whose life and work sit at the intersection of justice, healing, and systems transformation. He is the CEO of the Safe Alliance in Austin, Texas, one of the nation's largest and most comprehensive organizations supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, trafficking, and child abuse. What makes Pierre's leadership so powerful isn't just his resume, though it is extensive. He has led a global nonprofit, co-founded national centers on domestic violence and systems change, expanded housing system for survivors in D.C., Washington, D.C., and directed Harvard University's efforts to respond to interpersonal harm. And he has a powerful personal story, which I am going to let him share. Welcome, Pierre. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you get here?
Thanks. It's a delight to be here. I so appreciate the invitation. I'm originally from Peru, so I immigrated with my family when I was a kid, and we immigrated. If anyone is familiar with the history of Peru, in the 80s and 90s, we went through an internal warfare, and so there were a number of push factors and pull factors that had my family leave the country. And we grew up with tremendous privilege in many ways and tremendous instability in many other ways, right? And so what I saw in Peru was, and I always say this, the vacuum in systems, the vacuum in governmental supports, of structural support, and ended up leaving vacuums in people's stability and ability to thrive in communities. And I saw how those vacuums also further marginalized communities. And when we moved to the United States in the suburbs of Texas, I also saw firsthand how lack of supports, lack of systems, lack of community sometimes ended up marginalizing my family, right? My father had his pay stolen, for instance, at what point, right? As a member of the LGBTQ community myself, you experience marginalization in different ways, right? So not to down a sad story necessarily, but what came out of that was this real kind of keen understanding of how when systems fail, we leave behind individuals. But more importantly, what organizations end up doing is they address that individual person-based failure, right? I became super interested in systems change because what really we should be doing as leaders is looking at systems holistically and seeing how do we create the conditions for communities and individuals to thrive in those communities. And so I dedicated my life and my career to going back between kind of individual systems-based, community-based organizations and then national or international efforts to reform systems. And I've always played in that kind of field in social services, human services, public health, and that's kind of my playground and my
Yeah.
passion. And I think that history, my personal history, means that the careers that I've chosen or that the work that I've done is not a job, it's a calling, it's a vocation. That's how I feel about what I do.
I can totally see that. And boy, are you in a great field for the work of complex systems, domestic violence, sexual violence, trafficking, child abuse. I want to go into some of that systems thinking today for sure. But I also want to ask you, as a CEO with all this experience, like what do you think are the key things at the being at the top leadership level? Like how are you involved in your role, and how should others be involved if they want to learn, follow your example? What level are you involved in that systems change? What does that look like as the CEO?
Yeah, so there are different kind of spheres of systems change, right? So people usually say systems and they mean government levels. That is one aspect of it, but there are systems in the fabric of the organization as well, right? And I don't
Mhm.
mean kind of operational IT systems. I mean the way that we do things, the culture that we've created, right? There's an anthropologist who says, the difference between a wink and a blink is that's what culture is, right?
Mm.
And those are the systems that we are operating within an organization, right? Are important. And it's important for me to rely on the executive team, on the leadership team in general, on the organization to help us shape that culture, but not get down into the weeds of it because it's hard to see the trees whenever you're looking at the mushroom in the forest. I don't know, I just made that up. So for me, it's really important to pay attention to the whole ecosystem of the organization, what is creating a culture, right? Then there is the system of the city of Austin, right? The network, the incredible network of folks that we have not just in the city, but also the nonprofits we partner with, the corporations that support us. I'll give you an example. HEB, one of the biggest, right? Like it's kind of like a cult here in Austin,
Yeah.
Texas, right?
For those
People.
non-Texas people, as a recent learner about Texas, it's the grocery store chain, and I have to attest, it is awesome.
You're a convert. They are an example of folks who are invested in their community, in the community, right? There's a burger chain here that is incredible called P. Terry's. Again, I mean, just the philanthropic love that they show, not just through funding, but through showing up in their communities, just absolutely incredible, right? And so systems change. It's about short processes. It's about looking at what we're doing well and what not, but it's also about relationships. And so my role as CEO is investing in those relationships and setting up the rest of the organization to be able to have ambassadors throughout the community. And then there is systems that are survivors or the people that we work with kind of interact with, right? Child protective services, whether the police, right? Hospital systems. And again, you hold systems accountable and you transform systems through
Mhm.
relationships and through dialogue. And so being involved in those conversations as well and leveraging the power of both the organization and our stewards, that the folks who are such huge supporters of who we are, right? Becomes an essential part of my job.
Yeah. I love that you brought up all those things, and right, that high level activities in each category: internal systems, culture. I always like to say, we don't just pour culture like on our organizations. They come through, culture emerges as a result of the activities that become like, and the
Yeah.
processes that become habitual. So we start by putting in processes, habits, activities, systems, and we get culture out as of that. But then also, I want to touch on you talking about like you're interacting with systems. And I want to go in to this because I think a lot of organizations deal with the decision making around we interact with a system that is flawed or multiple flawed systems. When do we try to influence the system? When do we fill in a gap that we know is like just urgent and we can't just let it exist? How do we recognize when we shouldn't be filling in that gap anymore? Because we shouldn't just like maybe take on all of the problems, like of all the broken systems and say, we got it, right? You don't need to do it. That might be too much. I just want to go, since you have so much experience into this, how do you work through? What are you thinking about when you're making decisions around changing the system, filling in the gaps, those things?
So I'm going to pull this conversation up even a little higher based on
Yeah.
on a question that you and I talked about around nonprofits as testing grounds for what we call community problem solving, right? And nonprofit sector has been positioned for decades as a backstop for everything that breaks in society, right? Housing and healthcare and safety and education, I mean, you name it. The answer becomes a nonprofit, right? And nonprofits have carried that burden with extraordinary courage, right? And when we only see them, though, as a last resort respondent, we miss a deeper potential here. And nonprofits are, in many ways, civic laboratories, right? They're spaces where communities experiment with new ways of solving problems together, right, in community and systems, right? Ways that government may be too constrained to try, perhaps. Markets maybe have no incentives to explore, right? And at SAFE, one of my favorite examples of this is a program that we have called Planet Safe. And it's a supervised child exchange program for families that are navigating really high conflict situations. And they're often court mandated or court referred. And so parents who can't safely interact, right, or who can't be in the same parking lot without escalating, without getting into an exchange, right? The exchange of words or physical exchange. They can exchange their children in a space that is designed to remove that volatility, to remove
Mm-hmm.
that fear, to remove that harm, right? And I've seen the power of that intervention when a child walks in anxious, right, guarded, and leaves calmer because they didn't have to witness conflict between the people who are raising them. And it's a profoundly simple idea. You create a safe space for safe handoffs. But it's also a really sophisticated civic intervention, right? Because it asks, what would co-parenting look like if we build safety in the actual infrastructure of our community, right? So I think it tests a version of justice that is not punitive, but that is preventative. And
Yeah.
and 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 while models like this exist in other jurisdictions, right, here it's not that well funded at the level that the need demands, right? And yet it persists because nonprofits innovate long before systems catch up. And so that's the role of a civic laboratory, right? When we shift the frame, several things end up becoming possible. So I'll just name a couple of things, right? One, we experiment, right? So nonprofits can prototype interventions, relationships,
I
right?
want to highlight
Yeah,
that because I feel like nonprofit and running experiments should be like, we should like think about them like as this is a thing
that's
nonprofits do,
right.
but it doesn't make it into the lexicon very often. So I just want to
Mm,
like just drill it in. Like nonprofits should be experimenting. Experiments are good.
yeah,
Experiments lead to innovation. One of my missions for the nonprofit space is nonprofits as an industry should, when we think of which industries are best at innovation, we shouldn't be
yes,
thinking like Google and Meta, and we should be thinking nonprofits.
yeah,
So
yeah. We're
just like
disruptors.
elevating experimentation
No, I
for,
so
yeah,
appreciate you elevating that point because I always say it's like we are laboratories, right? And Planet
yes,
Safe, the program that I just talked to, is a prototype, right? It's a microsystem for conflict de-escalation and for child well-being. That's what it is. The
yeah,
second thing that happens is we end up practicing democratic imagination, right? It's like when we ask like what would justice look like if we designed it around the child? What does safety look like beyond policing? What does
yeah.
accountability look like without reproducing the harm? So that's the other thing that happens. The next thing that happens is we co-design alternative futures in miniature. I mean, every program, including Planet Save, is essentially a small scale version of the world we want to live in, right? One where, where families are navigating conflict without violence, right? Where children are not the collateral damage of our tensions, of our disagreements, right? Where safety is designed into the environment. So there is that. And then the final thing that I'll say is that we can generate knowledge that doesn't exist elsewhere, right? Because nonprofits end up sitting closest to the lived experience of people, and we often see emerging problems first, right? So we develop the first drafts of those solutions, if you will, and courts and policymakers end up learning from what we build. That's the invitation from my end, is the invitation to stop seeing nonprofits as permanent triage units for societal failure, as emergency rooms, right? And instead we begin recognizing them as engines of community problem solving.
Yeah. I love that so much. And I want to add for those listeners out there thinking, that's hard to fundraise for, or we have to be good stewards of money. I'm putting up the air quotes. We can't experiment. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. But in my experience, donors, when you present it as we're going to run a beta program, we're going to run an experiment, we're going to see if we can create a solution that can then be scaled like into the world beyond us, they love that.
Mhm.
It is highly compelling to say, we're not just going to run a program, we're going to test and test until we find a
Yeah.
solution that can be implemented way beyond us. What are your thoughts and experiences in fundraising in that paradigm that you're inviting us to?
Part of it is also switching or flipping the fundraising paradigm, to use your word. Oftentimes, nonprofits, we as leaders go out and beg for resources.
Yeah.
And I flip that and I say, I'm not begging you for resources. I'm a business item in your ecosystem of the city of service provision that is literally saving you millions of dollars a year. Save works with about 1,000 people a day, 1,000 people a day. And given the volume of folks we work with, we are saving the city of Austin, the county, anywhere from $60 million a year on a conservative estimate to 120.
All
You're
right,
getting a
there's
phone call there.
I am. I should. It's my child. Let me. Here we will have something to edit. The very rare moment, as I ignore, I'm just going to text him that he's coming home from skiing. Okay,
Nice.
I think now everybody has been informed, and there's no emergency. They
No,
just want
all
me
good. Where do you want me to pick up from?
to. Okay, wherever feels like a natural restart.
Sure. Yeah. So oftentimes we end up looking at nonprofits as a charity case, and we're providing a good feel good service for the community. And that is correct. That is true. We are a social lifeline for our communities, but we're also business line items, literally, that are saving millions of dollars to cities. So save, as I was mentioning, we end up serving 1,000 people a day. We house 1,000 people a night, and without our services, on a conservative estimate, we end up saving the city with our services about $60 million, and a conservative estimate about $120 million a year. So anywhere from 60 to 120. We end up saving the hospital just through our forensic sexual assault examinations program. We end up saving the hospital system, the healthcare system, anywhere from $5 to $10 million a year. That program costs $1.52 million a year for us. The investment in a program like ours results in
Yeah.
concrete savings. So it's easy to fundraise, if you will, or easier, I should say, whenever you make that compelling argument of
Yeah.
not just the human element, which is critical, but also you know what, I don't have a statutory obligation to provide forensic examinations. The hospitals do.
Right.
But you know
Yeah.
what? If we close our program, all of that goes to you. We have
Right.
an investment here in partnership. And not only is it going to cost you, but one, you're not going to do it as well. And two, it's going to cost you more and you're
So
going to
there's
increase your
that real
liability.
investment incentive,
That's
right?
right.
Like this is an investment that when they make is going to have it has a financial return in the form of savings, right? That are saving you because they invest in you.
And
That's
so
so
those
key.
prototypes, yeah, those prototypes that end up saving money. It's like, why wouldn't you want to test a prototype that is going to save you millions of dollars in the end? Of course you would. Sorry, anyway, I interrupted.
No, no, that's okay. I think, and I don't want to be harsh to the nonprofit community, but when I see, and I say this with so much love, when I see nonprofits struggling with money, 9 times out of 10, in a certain way, they're doing it to themselves in that they are adopting narratives that are in nonprofit culture that are limiting narratives. And these are not necessarily the narratives that the outer for profit culture or donor space has. And by changing the narrative with something and putting in something compelling from the donor's perspective, there's so much opportunity because I
Yeah,
think, donors they benefit, their communities benefit, they benefit financially, they benefit emotionally. So I think this is really, really key. And I love the example that you shared. I'll share a quick story because we were talking about I've been in Austin several times, and I was actually the last time I was in Austin in November was at an event with a bunch of entrepreneurs who were very charitably minded, visionary, just like generous people. We were at an event about how to have more generous, loving relationships that also
hmm
help business. So that was like the context. And I started telling some of these entrepreneurs some of my thoughts about how these two communities could interact better. And before I knew it, I was telling entrepreneurs, did you know that there's a way that your gift could have a 4x or more return
Mhm.
on investment? And they're like, oh my God, tell me, right? Like, how can my gift like be worth even more? And I flip the script. You will recognize this as a limiting thing, right? What do not people not want to give to? Overhead. Inside overhead, what's the thing they would least ever
Mhm.
never want to give to? The fundraising department. And I was convincing entrepreneur after entrepreneur. I was like, first of all, you should never restrict your gift. But if you were to, if your dollars go to a program, if you give $10,000 to a program, you will get $10,000 of impact. If you give your $10,000 to the fundraising department, you will get at least $40,000 of impact.
Mhm.
And if they keep reinvesting a portion of that in their fundraising department, your gift could be worth many hundreds of times what you
Mhm.
gave. And here, with just a few simple words, I had for profit entrepreneurs like ready to like just give to the thing that most nonprofits think is the least fundable. And I made it the most fundable, the most desirable thing to
That's
give
great.
to. Because I don't subscribe to that belief that people don't
That's
want
right.
to fundraising
Yeah.
or give.
Yeah.
Yeah, just, highlighting that point. And I want to ask you a little bit related to that about scarcity.
Hmm.
So tell me more about like, how do we flip this script from scarcity to nonprofits, thinking about abundance, stability, spaciousness?
Yeah, abundance, I feel, is in the social lexicon right now because Ezra Klein ended up publishing the book on abundance, and it's anyway. So, but when I talk about abundance in nonprofits, we're really talking about possibilities, and I don't want people to assume that I mean money here, right? Of course, resources matter. Don't get me wrong. Never going to argue against money, but abundance or possibility, as I'm using the word, it's actually, I think, a design question. It's the DNA, the fabric of an organization, right? It's about the conditions that allow people to breathe, to think, right? Do their best work when the external environment is so turbulent, which it is right now.
Yeah.
And I've been in enough organizations to recognize that abundance is rarely just a financial category, right? I've seen organizations with huge budgets living in really deep scarcity and organizations with really modest resources that are cultivating this feeling of spaciousness, right? And that spaciousness comes from intentional design choice. So for me, abundance or possibility shows up in quite practical ways. So when people, for example, know how decisions get made and they don't waste cognitive and emotional energy navigating ambiguity, like
Mm.
leadership's ambiguity, that's creating possibility and abundance. When planning cycles are predictable, teams can shift from bracing for impact to actually designing for impact. That's possibility. When workloads you structure with buffers, right? Because we know that work involving trauma or complexity or public systems requires recovery time, right? So one of the things that we do in the domestic violence field is we give people 15, 20 case advocate, an advocate has a caseload of 15, 20 people. At SAFE, each of our advocates has a max of 8 people because
Mm.
it provides that buffer and that ability to work with people more intentionally. When middle managers are trained and supported because they are the emotional backbone and the emotional barometer, if you will, of the organization. So abundance, I think, also has this psychological dimension for that reason, right? It's the feeling that we have enough to make thoughtful choices, enough time, enough trust, clarity, and enough internal coherence. And
Yeah.
one of the reasons that I emphasize that abundance is that because of it's scarce, it's not only, as I mentioned, financial scarcity, but structural and psychological scarcity. When we say scarcity, this collapses our imaginations, right? Like all these things, all these kind of different elements just collapse our ability to imagine what's possible. It narrows our sense of what's possible. So abundance ends up widening that lens, I think. It gives us the freedom to ask better questions, to focus on strategy, right, rather than on just survival, right? We're building rather than reacting, right? So I'm asking us to pay attention to the design features that create the stability and the spaciousness in the midst of chaos and constraint, right? So that to me is really important.
Yeah, I am so in agreement and thinking about, I just want to highlight you saying like when we have scarcity mindset, when we're afraid of something. I was thinking about this just this morning actually on my morning walk and meditation and thinking about how, you when we're in that mindset, that scarcity space and an issue appears, we see it
Mm-hmm.
as an obstacle, usually as a wall we can't get through or over, or a cliff that we're too
Yeah.
scared. We're like, oh, we can't jump off that cliff. That's too crazy. We'll die. It'll be awful. And and then the more we have a stress or a fear response, the more that cliff is a cliff and the wall is a wall. But if we
Mm.
can systematically move into that abundance mindset, the spaciousness, the place where our brain isn't so stressed, like what you said, like your creative brain clicks on. And when you can get to that place, design a system so you get to that place more easily. When your creative brain clicks on, you usually realize, in my experience, that cliff is just a teeny step, like 6 inches
Mm-hmm.
down. And that wall isn't really a wall. You can actually walk through it or around it, or it's just a little step. It's like you're either in that self perpetuating cycle of scarcity and fear and challenge, or you're in that cycle of abundance, creativity, and opportunity.
Mm.
I'd love for you to share some more examples because I think this is so important. Like, what are like the day-to-day things that help us be in the cycle of abundance and opportunity and creativity?
Yeah, I mean, your listeners might have heard this already, right? But one of the first things that I do when I go into an organization, I define for people, and I remember reading this in a book, or maybe somebody told me, I don't remember, but I define for people who their primary team is.
Mm,
And that's really critical, right? So here at Save, I said to the executive team, this is your primary team. This is where you duke it out. This is where you put the merits and demerits of an argument, where you debate the proposals that are for the organizations, and more importantly, you're stewards and custodians of the organization, not of the teams that report to you. And
mm,
that's really hard because oftentimes, right, of course, these are the team that reports to you. Those are the ones that you work with day in and day out. So of course you have their best interests at heart. And that's what I hear from my team. It's like, well, I'm always going to represent my team. I'm always going to go to bat for them. And I said, of course, that is the other side of your role, is to bring the team's perspective, right, their positions, their interests, full force to this meeting. But you are depending on your colleagues in this room, and it's the executive leadership team, to poke holes in that, to ask questions, to challenge you, to shift or shape the thinking of what the decision is going to be. And you might get out of this meeting having 95% of what your team wanted and not 100%. But when you go out of this room, your role is to support your colleagues because you've all debated the merits and demerits of a proposal. Like this is one example. And when you go back to the team, here is the ways that we undermine each other inadvertently, right? We'd say like, oh, we talked about it, and I really do support this decision. Just this little piece right here, I wasn't too sure about, right? Like, I said no. That's how you end up creating instability in an organization, which leads to scarcity of trust, right? That's one example. And
totally.
so and then I said, now, here is what you might not like to hear. My primary team as a CEO is actually not this team. This is my secondary team. My primary team is the board.
Mm-hmm.
But you better believe that when I go to the board, who are stewards and partners of the organizations as well, because we've debated and we've landed in a position here as ELT, as executive leadership team, I'm going to take that to the board, and I'm going to be your best damn advocate with that board to try to figure out where do we land. But it might be that I have to come back and say, you know what, this is where we landed. And the rich engagement that we had with the board led us to that place. And my responsibility is transparency on both ends, right? To the board as to why we're making this recommendation, and to you as to why we might have landed somewhere else, the risks, the liability, et cetera, that we struggled with, the ethical distress of our decision.
Yeah.
So that's really important, that alignment, who your team is, who you're responsible to, because when we don't have that clarity and expectation setting for how that we navigate those spaces, again, we create scarcity of trust.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's one
almost like
example.
the team you lead, like you're their coach, and then the team, like your executive leadership team for each other, like they're their teammates,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're
Mm-hmm.
all in it to win the same game, and then
Yeah.
they have to go off and coach their sub teams to help them play.
Right. It's a good analogy here is a soccer, team or football, right? When you're in the field, that's your team. Even though you have many stakeholders, you have the owners, you have the press, you have the
Yeah,
spectators, you have, I can, you have the companies that are sponsoring you. If you have them in mind first, your team is going to fail,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Who is your team in that context and in that moment is really important.
yeah. I love it. Well, before we wrap up, I have a question I've been asking my guests recently. From your perspective as a nonprofit CEO, as a nonprofit leader, what is the one thing that if you or a leader like really nails or dials in, makes everything else easier or not necessary?
Say that again. What is
Yeah,
the
what's
one
the one
thing?
thing that as a leader, if you really dial in that skill or get that thing accomplished, makes everything else in your job easier or even unnecessary?
Hmm. So, one of the quiet truths of leadership, I think, is that most of us are leading inside environments that are fundamentally incoherent. The needs are rising, the resource, some people call them competing priorities, right? When the resources are flat or declining. Here in Austin, for example, we're seeing huge budget cuts to social services, right? And the expectations then are contradictory, right? And on top of that, the systems around us, healthcare, housing, police, et cetera, justice system, right? They don't talk to each other. And at SAFE, that incoherence is layered onto the fact that we work in real crisis, and we're supporting people who have been sex trafficked. We're working with children who are coming from really neglected environments, from abuse, where we're intervening in cases where the perpetrator has shot their partner and the family is trying to piece itself back together, right? We deal with life and death situations. So yes, we work in crisis, but that doesn't mean that we as an organization have to operate in crisis.
Mm,
And that's where coherence for me comes in, right? That clarity is helpful, but clarity enough. We always talk about clarity in among leadership. Clarity enough is not alone is not it's not enough. I think coherence asks a different type of question, right? Do our values, decisions, and behaviors align? Not
yeah.
in theory, right, but in practice. And even when the world around us doesn't. And coherence is a daily discipline of alignment. And it looks like making decisions for the right decisions, not just for the fast ones, right? When you work in crisis, it's really easy to make decisions from a fast perspective, right? Being predictable in how you lead, even when the context isn't predictable. Creating consistency between what we say matters and what we actually reward or what we actually rescue,
Mhm.
and making sure that people understand how decisions were made, not just what was decided. So
Yeah.
when coherence is present, people will say it's not perfect, but there is an internal logic that holds. And that consistency it becomes a kind of psychological buffer, if you want to call it that, whatever you want, I don't know, protection.
Yeah.
And it's what allows us to hold steady when everything else feels quite unstable. So now I don't want anyone at Safe who is hearing this, I'm thinking, wait a second, he's lying, right? Sometimes we are running like chickens with our heads cut off, and yes, that is true in so many cases, right? Because the work is urgent, it's unpredictable, it's messy.
Yeah.
But what I've also seen, and let me just end with it, what I've also seen in my short time here is this real intentionality around pausing where we can, setting aside time to think, to design, to ask, what's the right way to do this? Just yesterday, if you allow me to give this example, I was touring one of our buildings and I walked into our warehouse and pantry area. And I saw this incredible coordination, processes, flows, signage, organization, right? A level of coherence that put order and dignity into what could otherwise be a chaotic, even re-traumatizing experience for survivors trying to access food or household items, right? And that didn't happen just out of nowhere by accident, right? It happened because those people leading the warehouse, leading the pantry, food pantry, paused long enough to say, what would make this experience easier? What would make this experience more humane, more coherent? And sure, we can always do more, right? We're always going to fall short of the fullness of our ambition. But I think coherence it's not a checkbox or something that is binary. It's not like, do we do it or we don't do it? It's really a practice. And I always say that incoherence is inevitable, but incoherence doesn't have to define us. Coherence is how we resist being shaped by that chaos, how we resist that tumultuousness. It's how we protect ourselves and our values from eroding. And over time, I think it does create steadiness. It's our internal spine, right? That people can feel steady by, can root themselves in. So try to find coherence as much as possible in your teams.
I love that answer so much. I encourage folks to rewind and listen to that again. There's so much in there. I want to highlight one thing that I've heard you now say more than once that was kind of slipped in subtly, but I think is so important, that people need to understand why you decided something, or like what went into that decision, not just what the decision is. And I'd go even farther and say, often if they know what went into the decision making, they don't even care what the decision. I mean, they need to know what it is. But the most important thing is to know and to feel comfortable that like enough went into it, that it was informed and considered. And once they feel that, they'll go wherever, they'll be like, sign me up, whatever it is, like I'm on board, right? I trust your process, how what you did to make this decision. And I'll go with any decision you made, even if it doesn't, it's not what I would have chosen. That's something I'm picking up on. That I grew up quite a bit in the Quaker practice of leadership. And that kind of very much aligns with this concept of what census, not consensus, but census. And true consensus works with this concept of census and the concept of standing aside, the concept that you will go along with something that isn't what your opinion, but you believe that going along with what the group is sensing, leaning towards, is the right thing, because you want to move the group forward, not your own ego forward. It's a skill that we learn. So I wanted to just kind of highlight that. And I think it really goes with that coherence feeling about moving a group forward in coherence. It's really important, because what are we doing, right? We're moving our organizations forward towards achieving our missions. Yeah. Wonderful.
I love that.
For those folks who are like, yes, I want more of this, like, how can I follow along or keep in touch? Who should be reaching out, and what's the best way for people to either reach out or follow you directly?
Sure. I mean, my website is pierreberastain.com. So that's where people can reach out to me specifically. Our social media for Safe Alliance is at SafeATX, like Austin, Texas, right? SafeATX on Instagram, on LinkedIn, I believe X as well, but don't quote me on that. And then our website is safeaustin.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all your wisdom and care and consideration in how you lead and everything you shared today. And thank you out there for listening and everything you do to make our communities better. As always, I ask you the favor to subscribe and leave a review for this podcast wherever you're listening to it, and or share it with a friend or colleague who could benefit, so that we can get this information that we share on inspired nonprofit leadership, which isn't always the way. It's often not the way most people talk about leadership at nonprofits. It's very much the way we talked about in this episode of experimenting and leading from a place of abundance. So we need your help in spreading that word across our community. Until next time, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.